everybody. Welcome again to our weekly COVID-19 briefing. Thank you very much for joining. As usual, it's Tony Consul here in Geneva, Head of Communications at IATA, along with my colleagues, Brian Pearce, our Chief Economist, and our Director General and Chief Executive Officer, Alexandre Juniac. We'll begin with a little bit of analysis from Brian, then move on to Alexandre for a few remarks, and then we'll throw it open to questions and answers via the chat function. So with that, Brian, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. The following slides are assessing the prospects for domestic markets, because we see this as the key to the developments for air transport once the lockdown finishes. We think that domestic markets are likely to open up first. International markets are likely to be much slower to open up, but obviously that's something that we are working hard to get a coordinated response on. But this really is focused on the domestic part. For airlines, it's really revenue passenger kilometres that are the key metric driving revenues. So domestic market represent 1/3 of that business, or at least it did in 2019. For airports and other players, it's actually passenger numbers, and actually the domestic markets represent almost 60% of total passenger numbers. So those businesses might be in a sort of better position once markets start to open up. So let's just look at where we are today. And one way of looking at that is the number of flights that are taking place up until a few days ago. And as you can see, the global average is that we essentially have 30% of the flights that would typically take place. They're down 70% compared to where we were in early January. And actually, in most regions, domestic markets the fleet is grounded, more or less, apart from cargo flights and repatriation flights. Really, that global level is sustained by North America and Asia Pacific. And if we look at the top 10 domestic air travel markets, it's clear that this is dominated by the United States and by China. Together, in RPK terms, they have 65%, so roughly 2/3 of total domestic revenue passenger kilometres, or more than 50% in terms of passenger numbers. The other top 10 markets are in Asia and in the emerging markets, and they're relatively evenly spread. But obviously, the key to, once obviously we've got the Chinese market open, but once other markets begin to open during the third quarter, the key to the strength of growth will clearly be from the United States and China. So that will be key to the overall impetus to air travel in the third quarter. So let's just take a look at the experience of China, because the Chinese domestic market began to resume operations from late February, when we saw the new cases of COVID-19 in mainland China fall well below 10% into single figures quite rapidly towards zero. That was the key trigger for resumption of flights. And what we did see was a reasonably significant increase in flights fairly quickly, in the next couple of weeks. But as you can see, that recovery has stalled at a level where flights are around 45% of normal levels. Our interpretation of why that was the case is shown here. and that is that the initial recovery was China returning to work. As we can see from these confidence measures, and the last point on those lines is for March, manufacturing is pretty much back to normal. At least it's back to a position where manufacturers are saying, we're out of the recession, or at least manufacturing output is stable. There was a return to work. But as you can see, the services side of China is still much, much weaker, still in recession territory. And certainly, while we've seen travel associated with the return to work, but also visiting friends and relatives, we've not seen the recovery of leisure. And as you can see, businesses are not as confident. Consumers remain cautious, which is why we've seen that plateauing after the initial return to work, return to visiting friends and relatives rise. And we need to see an improvement in confidence to get a fuller recovery. I think those are the lessons from the Chinese experience. So where do we stand with the other top 10 domestic markets, at least in terms of where they are in dealing with the coronavirus? And what we show here is, to be comparable with the Chinese experience, we show the number of new cases as a percentage of the total. And we've smoothed out the ups and downs with a 7-day moving average. I think what's clear is, apart from the fact that China is stable now, Australia is also at a point where cases have almost stopped increasing, and the US is seeing also quite a rapid deceleration in new cases. It's down to around about 5%. And then there's a group of others where the trend is perhaps less obvious, and clearly, Russia is at a much earlier stage at the moment. So let's just turn to the Australian case, because I think that's an interesting case, given that Australia has also seen the number of new COVID-19 cases fall pretty much to zero in recent days. But as you can see, we've certainly not seen any resumption of domestic flights, and indeed the move into voluntary administration of Virgin Australia shows the difficulties of that market. And obviously, sort of key question for us is, what's the difference here between markets like Australia and markets like China, where actually we have seen some recovery, but obviously that recovery has plateaued. Before I go on to that, just I think it's important to examine the biggest domestic air travel market, and that is the US. As a earlier slide showed, the US are also seeing a rapid deceleration in the number of new COVID-19 cases. They're not at the stage that China or more recently Australia have reached. But looking at the trajectory, it looks certainly by the third quarter, if that trajectory continues, that they could be in a similar position. What we have seen in the US is that the domestic flights have not been quite as severely affected, but certainly the stability you're seeing in recent days is partly due to the requirements of the aid packages, particularly the CARES Act, requiring some service level. But obviously the key issue for us when we're looking to the third quarter is, is this market going to turn up, perhaps in a similar way to China, and are there additional measures that could be implemented? So why is there the difference between China and what we've seen in Australia and what we're obviously still seeing a depressed market in the US. I think confidence is everything. What we see here is that confidence amongst businesses in particular have risen to a much higher level than where they had fallen in February. So in March, they're not quite out of recession territory in China. And indeed, we have not seen anywhere near a full recovery in domestic air travel. But businesses in China are generally feeling much more confident than they had been at the depths of the crisis. And I think that's an important reason for some of the recovery in domestic markets that we've seen happening in China. But as you can see, the clear reason for the Australian market not recovering is that confidence is still rock bottom in March. The same is true in the US, and this is obviously a product of the recession. And that will be a sort of clear determinant of confidence. So once market travel restrictions and the lockdowns are relaxed, there is still an issue about will there be the demand from travellers, from passengers to come back and fly. If we look at the economic situation in China and the US, and these are quarterly forecasts that are produced by Oxford Economics, but I think this is quite a typical economic forecast and a typical profile for expected economic developments, with a very severe second quarter, an unprecedented decline in economic activity in the second quarter, some recovery in the third quarter, but as you can see, it's a pretty muted, small recovery. Given those circumstances, and obviously the job losses that will be associated with, economic conditions will still be damaging passenger confidence during the third quarter. So the economic environment that we're expecting over the next 6 months is one that is really not conducive to any substantial return to air travel for financial reasons, which is why, and this is a chart we showed last week, we're expecting to see that recovery in the third quarter to be relatively modest. Right, okay. So what you'll find in your press packs is also some information on a passenger survey that IATA carried out in February and also more recently in early April. The critical information in that is that we asked passengers when they would be returning to travel after the containment announcement had been relaxed. And what was clear was that there weren't very many people, only 14% in the April survey, who wouldn't wait at all. They would travel straight away. A larger number would travel in 1 or 2 months. So within 2 months, there were approximately 60% of passengers who said that they would travel. So clearly there is some pent-up demand, which would overcome some of the damage from the economic recession. But I think the issue is there are 40%, there are more than 40% of passengers who said they would wait, they would delay travelling for 6 months or more. So I think the key point here is that we really do need to see measures to help restore passenger confidence in order to regenerate the demand for air travel. Without any new measures, we're likely to see a slow recovery of demand when markets open. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Brian. I'll now turn it over to Alexandre to provide a few comments before we open for questions. Alexandre, I think you're still on mute. If you could unmute, that would be... Okay. Alexandre, if you can hear us, you are still on mute.
So while we're waiting, perhaps I could just say that there was one slide that was missing from the slides that I just showed at the end, which showed results of our passenger survey of confidence. But that slide will be distributed in the pack by our comms team. So you'll find that there with the evidence of consumer sentiment, travelers' sentiment in February and in our most recent survey in April. So that will show the timing that passengers have said that they would follow for a return to travel. Thank you.
Okay. Well, Alexandre is sorting. Alexandre, can you try now? No, we still cannot hear you. Maybe what we'll do is we'll go to questions for Brian first, and then we will, if you're able to join, we'll reconnect with you. Okay. So, first question is from the Middle East. Which says, how much government support will be required for airlines in the Middle East and North Africa regions?
Yes, I mean I suppose we were focusing here on the restart, on the recovery. It's certainly the case that in Africa, the industry and the economies, the people are at an earlier stage of the crisis, and I think the priority certainly in Africa is for support as the damage intensifies. We've seen 95% of Africa's flights grounded. There are some cargo flights, there are some repatriation flights, but we've seen some very severe damage. So we're expecting to see revenues down by something like $6 billion US dollars. The industry is obviously smaller in Africa than it is in the US and Europe and Asia, but clearly we're going to need to see multinational agencies and governments providing support to airlines and other members of the value chain to preserve the connectivity that Africa needs, and it'll need to support the recovery period when that comes.
Okay, thank you. We have another question which talks about the collapse of Virgin Australia. What will the impact of that be?
Yes, I mean it's a really unfortunate. This is what we've been expecting to see happening in many markets of the world. You'll recall we showed our estimates of the rate at which airlines were burning through their remaining cash balances. This quarter, because of the unavoidable costs that airlines have, even if they're grounded, and also because of the scale of ticket refunds, airlines are burning through something like $60 billion during the quarter. And we knew that at the start of the year, airlines had roughly 2 months worth of cash in the bank to be able to cover this sort of crisis, and a cash burn at that rate soon uses it up. And unfortunately, that's what we've seen happening in Australia. So with the sad move into voluntary administration of Virgin Australia, they had been, I think, supplying something like 37% of domestic services in Australia. And obviously, you've got another very strong carrier there. I think the other thing about air transport markets is that they're pretty open to entry, and so I think that damaging though this will be, in the longer term, I think Australia is still going to see service resume. But obviously, this is incredibly disruptive, and this is one of the key reasons, one of the main reasons why IATA and the airlines are pushing for government support to try to sustain businesses for the future, for the recovery period.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We have a question about ticket prices in China and the US in the post-COVID period. Do we have any anticipation as to what that might do?
It's very difficult to say at this stage. I mean, what we have seen is that airlines, have reduced prices for air travel for the remaining air travel that has been taking place in the world. We've seen some pretty steep falls in fares and yields. State of the market as we come into the recovery period. There's obviously going to, I think it's pretty clear that the size of travel demand is going to be smaller, at least in the initial recovery period, and there are still lots of aircraft around, even if some of the airlines that were running them have failed. So that's typically the sort of environment where you get lower fares. On the other hand, it will also depend on the health measures that are imposed or are agreed upon. If utilisation rates of seats or indeed aircraft are much lower, then unit costs are going to be much higher than they would have been otherwise, which will which would point to higher prices. So, as I say, at the moment, it's not possible to be clear on what will happen to the cost of air travel. It partly depends on what governments and the industry agree on measures to allow the return to travel.
Okay. Let me just check. Alexandre, are you able to speak now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great.
Able to speak, not sure able to be heard.
No, we can hear you.
Okay.
Super. So we have a question about large airports like Dubai, for example. What steps should they be taking to become viable again? So what measures should airports be looking at as they anticipate or prepare for the containment of the COVID virus?
we'll have to see. But that's a question that is under study now. It's to know what type of sanitary and health control measures we have to implement to, first of all, to restore the confidence of passengers and to gather the acceptance of authorities, especially health authorities. So it's something on which we are working, which are pretty delicate because there is no scientific consensus on what has to be done at this stage.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about social distancing on board the aircraft. How can that be done, and will that mean planes flying at a loss?
No, it is very clear that if there is social distancing is imposed inside the aircraft, meaning you have to neutralize a huge proportion of seats, at least a third, for a short and mid-haul aircraft. It means two things: that either you fly at the same price, selling the ticket at the same average price as before, and then you lose enormous amount of money, so it's impossible to fly for any airline, and particularly the low cost, or you increase the ticket price for similar travel by at least 50%, and then you are able to fly with minimum profit. And so it means that if social distancing is imposed, the cheap travel is over for a while.
Okay. We have a question about potential measures like wearing of masks on board the aircraft or throughout the travel process, or limiting cabin baggage. Do you think these would improve or worsen consumer confidence?
No, the more measures that are the more measures we implement, such as distributing equipment, masks, gloves, or whatever, or limiting the number of luggage in cabin, provided that we do that in agreement with government, with the blessing, if I may, of the health authority. It should, I hope, it will restore the passenger confidence.
Okay. We have a question specific to the Gulf region, but asking what's our outlook for the UAE and the Gulf carriers in specific? And also, do you expect airlines to resume operations after just a few months, or do you think it'll be June or later?
To resume, I will answer the second part of the question for the Gulf region. Brian, if you can take it. But for
yes.
The resume operations, is what we have in mind is for airlines, but for the industry to resume operation progressively, step by step, starting with probably domestic, then regional, continental, and intercontinental, and it will last over a period of a few months. We do not expect a return to full operations before the end of Q4.
And on the first question, we do think that domestic markets are likely to open first, and long haul markets will probably be later on. So that's obviously an issue for the Sixth Freedom super connectors in the Gulf. Having said that, I would imagine that they also serve other markets, in particular the markets from India to the Middle East, which is associated a lot with the economy and workers and visiting friends and relatives. And I would expect those markets would probably recover rather more quickly.
We have a question on what we mean specifically by measures to improve passenger confidence.
be measures that would be considered by passenger and probably by government or health authority as limiting the possibility to spread the virus either to other passengers in the same aircraft or in the same airport, or to spread the virus from one country to another by transporting, people who get the virus. So that's if it's seen as safe, it will restore the confidence, and seen and demonstrated and proven by the health authority as safe.
Okay. We've been discussing domestic markets. We have a question that's focused more on the European situation. And it's saying there are a few the domestic markets in Europe tend to be very small. But does that mean that a return of flights will be held back, or will there be a pan-European return allowing flights across the continent? And will that be based on a single EU market, or do you think that will be determined by national governments within Europe?
Legally, it will be determined by each government, but they can agree to do that together in a collaborative way within the limits of the EU institutions or some EU agreements, whether it is the Eurozone or the Schengen area. That has to be seen, but. From our point of view, it would be more relevant, more effective, more efficient to have a common approach and a simultaneous approach, common to several states within the European area.
Okay. We have a question about the status of harmonization. We've called before for measures to be harmonized and coordinated across borders. What is the status of that for airports, for example, or on board, and what is the status of the regional reviews that we're conducting, or the regional summits that are occurring?
For the moment, we are having this regional summit. They have started yesterday. They will end by the end of the week. Then we will try to gather all the elements and contributions that will have been produced during the summit to enrich, to complement the restart plan we have proposed. First of all, secondly, we are trying to define some measures that we see after the summit could be common to either region, and even more preferably to be applicable worldwide, especially on sanitary and health control for passengers, crew within the airports or on board, so applicable by airlines and by airports, and with the consent of government and health authority. And we will present this set of measures to all governments for them to apply, to endorse, and to apply and implement. That is the idea behind it.
Okay. We have a question about smaller domestic markets, such as the UK, Spain, Italy, Germany, etc. Do we expect them to follow a similar pattern to what we've seen in China and Australia, or do we see something specific in these markets?
Well, I think that it will depend critically on the confidence of travellers. In the Chinese case, we saw once the coronavirus had been brought under control and markets opened up, there was a return. In particular, there was a return to work, and there was also an increase in visiting friends and relatives. And confidence was stronger in China. But we've not seen that happen in Australia, where confidence is very weak still because of the state of the recession. So I think it will depend critically on the recession. And I think it will also depend on the measures that Alexandre has just discussed. The measures that will be necessary to give passengers the confidence that the COVID-19 risk is minimised.
Okay, thank you. We have a question asking as to whether we see a difference in the way that the low-cost sector will return against the legacy carriers, and particularly in respect to domestic markets.
Sorry, for me the communication was very bad, so I didn't hear the question well.
So the question is, do we see low-cost or legacy carriers returning more quickly or more slowly? Or do we see a difference between the two?
That's a very good question. First of all, it will depend on the regions. Secondly, it will also depend on the measure that will be adopted by states to lift the restriction they have put on travel or the closure they have put on borders. If the measures are very demanding in terms of increasing turnaround time, reducing load factor, so having an impact on the efficiency of operations, which is the key element for the profitability of low cost, and a very important one, of course, for the legacy carriers. It could have an impact on the restart for each category of carrier. But it's difficult to say something different at this stage.
Okay.
As long as we don't know what the measures will be.
Right. We have a question about load factors. At what level of a load factor does an airline normally need in order to be profitable? And how do you see that in the current situation?
For the short haul and mid-haul network, usually 70-72% is a threshold. After, it depends also on the region, on the market, and on the yield that is the average yield on each market. But usually it's something around that figure. When the market is ultra competitive, it can go up to 78-79% of load factor. Again, for short and middle network.
Okay. We have a question about immunity passports. Do we think that a COVID-19 blood test will be a key for safe travel in the future?
The question of test is difficult scientifically. As you know, you have two types of tests. You have the direct test that you nose and nose on the mouth, and you have the blood test for antibody. Apparently, the reliability of the second category is still questionable. So, apparently the reliability of the first category is better, but the timing to make it to have the results of the test for the second category can be quick, so can match with systematic testing in an airport if countries would decided to adopt this type of measures. And the nose testing is, for the moment at least, the results are given in hours, which is not exactly compatible to an efficient process of testing, systematic testing before the flight. So it's too early. It's too early to see to give you the conclusion about what type of test we should adopt, what type of testing process we should adopt, and what the level of reliability and comfort we could have on this type of processes. Sorry, but it's a remark by someone who is not a specialist or only a reader.
Okay. Last week we said that traffic was down about 80%. Is that holding up this week, or do we see any difference?
No, that still looks on track.
Okay. We have a couple of questions around the Virgin Australia situation. First, Alexandre, do we have any comments on that? And secondly, do we anticipate more of the same in other regions?
The main comment I would have on the situation of Virgin Australia is that when we said that the situation of airlines was very fragile, that they were running out of cash, and that they desperately need cash injection, particularly from governmental rescue packages, it shows that it was true, and it is still true. Airlines are in a difficult situation. They are running out of cash. They need cash, and urgently. And the example of Virgin Australia is a perfect illustration of the warning we have put forward and the request we have put in front of governments, and the need for now a very, very quick and urgent implementation of the plans that have been announced.
Okay. We have a related question. Do we think that airlines that have already received some financial relief will need a second round of government support?
First of all, it will depend on the duration of the crisis. Secondly, on the possibility to restart and the way we'll be able to restart our operations. And thirdly, it will of course depend on the situation of each airline and the volume of the money that has been injected and the way it has been injected. So it's really a case-by-case approach. It's difficult. It's impossible to have a common view, which would be similar to all countries, all airlines, all support packages.
Okay. We have a question about jet fuel. Obviously, we've seen a tremendous fall in the price of oil. And the question is, how are airlines responding to that? And specifically, are they perhaps hoarding jet fuel to take advantage of the current prices?
I'm not sure. I speak right under your control that we have already statistics and that are significant about the airline behavior towards the jet fuel price.
Yeah, I mean, let me jump in. I guess the short answer is that airlines aren't using much fuel at the moment because they're not flying. But a lot of airlines have also got the difficulty that they made purchases ahead of the use through fuel hedging, which is in many cases, particularly in Europe, is adversely affecting their cash position. So, a number of airlines are actually unable to take advantage of the low prices, even if they were actually flying to use such fuel. I would point out, though, that what we saw was a dramatic fall in North American oil prices for particular reasons. Brent crude oil is still is still in the sort of $20s to $30s dollar a barrel range.
Okay. We have a question just asking us to clarify the revenue loss figures. Brian, could you do that?
Yes. So we issued last week a revised impact assessment where we took account of the further grounding of fleet, the deepening of the recession, and concluded that we'd see, on average, RPKs down 50%, almost 50%, I think 49%. Revenues, we estimated passenger revenues alone would be down 314 billion compared to 2019. So that's a fall of, I think it was 55%.
Okay. We have a question about the China market, and particularly with respect to the slides we showed about the US and Australia. Did we factor in the impact on the China analysis of the return from work after the Chinese New Year holiday? And do you see how does that compare to the other U.S. and Australia examples?
Yes, I guess that's correct in the sense that the holiday period was earlier, but I think the key point was there was a return to work once the lockdowns and the controls were lifted, and it was that activity as well as the ability of people to go and once more and visit friends and relatives that drove the initial upturn in the number of flights and in load factors, the number of passengers that we saw in late February, early March. But obviously since then we've seen a plateauing, a stabilisation of that.
Okay. We have a question about what airlines are doing with their fleets. The questioner asks or notes that airlines could be resorting to sale and leasebacks on aircraft to bolster their cash. Do we know anything or have any insight on the nature of contracts that might be concluded? Are the conditions more onerous than they might normally be? Do we expect the percentage of leased aircraft in the fleets to increase? Is there anything we can say on that?
Perhaps I could just say a couple of words before Alexandre adds some thoughts. I think in recent years we've seen a small number of airlines with very strong balance sheets having generated significant cash by their own aircraft, and they're able. So those aircraft, those assets, don't have any debt attached to them. They've been able to engage in sale and leaseback agreements in order to raise cash. But I think I'd emphasise that's a relatively small number of airlines. I think the majority of airlines don't have that option or the access to the capital markets, which is why we've really been calling for government support.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of questions about de-densification of the cabin again. So one is, do we have an estimation as to the economic impact of that? And the second is it only about the middle seat, or do we also see the seat pitch under consideration?
We don't have an economic impact of it. I mean, Alexandre may have some thoughts, but clearly, if this will really depend on the agreement, the standards on health requirements as to whether this is necessary. If there are requirements for spacing. For a middle seat to be empty, that would mean the maximum load factor on a short-haul flight at the most can be 66%. Alexandre's already mentioned that break-even load factors are typically in the 70s. So clearly, that would have a very negative impact on the economics of short-haul flying. Okay. Whether you've been right, Alexandre.
No, I have nothing to add. That's
Okay. We have a question on financial relief. Should governments assign priorities on how the subsidies to airlines should be used? Ideally, is it more important to protect aviation jobs or to invest in restructuring and adaptation?
I will tell you something. We are in a survival mode, so adding constraints to the very difficult situation in which we are struggling, I think is not a good idea. First of all, secondly, I think that the airlines and the management of the airlines are probably the best placed to use the money they have been given through the rescue package in the best way to maintain and to maintain their business alive in the best way, I think. So we rely on airlines management to find the appropriate way of allocating the money they receive to preserve their business, to maintain employment, and to be ready for restart, etc.
Okay. We have a number of questions about the regional summits. Can we give an update as to where we are with that, what the discussions are focused on?
We are in the middle of the exercise. It's subcontinent or continent by continent. So we are in the middle of the exercise. We have submitted the restart plan we have worked on, and it has been circulated to all the participants to the summit. We have submitted a list of measures or possibilities of parameters on which we could work to restart the industry. We are gathering the observations, the questions, the remarks, the compliments, the contributions to be able, first of all, to complete our restart plan and to be able to propose a set of measures that would be common for restarting the industry, particularly on at the end of the process, measures that would be accepted by governments, so civil aviation, would be accepted by health authorities, would be accepted by international organizations, and would be common to the most part of the planet, and if possible, by every state, and be implemented for this industry to restart properly. So we are aiming at full cooperation, full harmonization of measures, and thirdly, a very transparent consultation between public authorities, governments, international agencies, and the industry to have a plan that is manageable, affordable, applicable, and effective and efficient.
Okay. We have a question on the refunds versus vouchers issue. A survey by a publication called Which has found that airlines are not making refunds within 14 days. What is IATA's position on that?
You know that we are advocating in favor of using vouchers to refund the unflown tickets. It's not for pleasure that we are doing that. It's because we fully understand and we are fully aware that it could penalize some our passengers, that they prefer direct refund. But we think that vouchers, first of all, maintain the right to fly with of course the full price and the full possibility to fly. Secondly, we have proposed, especially to the EU, an alternative between a voucher or a late refund to avoid the refunding happening in the middle of the period in which we are under an enormous cash drain, and so this refund would add to our difficulties and probably push us into collapse. So we are offering several possibilities to find the right compromise between what we understand are the wishes of passengers, but also the enormous constraints under which we are operating currently.
Okay. We have a question about aid packages in Europe. The question says that they have mostly benefited the large or the legacy carriers rather than the large budget carriers who've had stronger balance sheets. Do you think that the government support being offered now may in fact end up inhibiting market consolidation?
Let me take that one. I don't think that's. I I don't think it's possible to say either way at the moment. I think, in most cases, governments are not discriminating. We're seeing grant support for payrolls and the like. I think the critical aim of governments and indeed central banks at the moment is to provide liquidity to all businesses in these exceptional times. I think that as we saw with Virgin Australia, the unfortunate thing is that that's not being provided in sufficient quantity or quickly enough, and inevitably, I think we will see some failures unless governments step up to the challenge more quickly, and that will, at least in the short term, lead to an industry with fewer players.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about how the crisis is impacting IATA itself. Have we had to furlough staff or make any adjustments?
What we have been doing is, first of all, we have started by protecting our employees, so we almost all work from home. Secondly, economically, we have implemented a strong cost reduction plan for our operation costs and project costs. We have also implemented a salary cut for the management team to contribute, and it has been 100% followed and supported by a very engaged and committed management team. So it involves up to something like 100 management people in IATA, and we have done everything, to protect the cash position of IATA, to maintain this organization. We have up to now, this plan has not included any staff reduction. So we have tried to protect employment and jobs.
Okay. We have one question on cargo, noting that several passenger airplanes are now being converted for cargo use. Do we see any issues with the way that the aircraft are being converted for this? How do we see the passenger fleet performing in this way?
The two issues we have seen at the beginning with the conversion of passenger to cargo was the safety issues in managing the new way of filling the cabin. We have issued immediately, in collaboration with ICAO, some safety guidelines that have been distributed to all airlines. So now the safety issue is covered, and the guidelines are applicable. And secondly, we have seen some elements for crew treatment that were not harmonized and sometimes difficult because some quarantine measures were imposed for some crews, and when it was not necessary. So we are dealing with that problem country by country, but the problem is progressively solved. The treatment of crew is harmonized and is based on facilitation, on measures that facilitate the cargo traffic without, of course, putting the safety or the health at stake, of course. Thirdly, we have seen a lot of countries or continents, implementing plans to facilitate cargo traffic, paperwork, custom issues, electronic treatment of administrative procedures, all that stuff. And it has been implemented in the US, in China, in Europe, and very successfully.
Okay, and we're just about running out of time, but we'll take one last question. The question is, are we collaborating with airports regarding asking them to reduce charges to the airlines, or, for example, jointly asking governments to provide relief to the sector?
No, the answer is yes. We are collaborating with airports to give us some relief. It's a discussion that we have with each airport between usually the main operators in the airport and the airport. And I have to say that the collaboration of airports and with the airport has been very good and very transparent.
Great. Thank you very much. That's all the time we have for this week. We will have a press release going out very shortly. Also, we'll be posting Brian's presentation on the website and linking that to the release, including the missing slide. So all that information will be available, as well as a copy of the prepared remarks for Alexandre, which reflect a lot of what was discussed in the Q&A for your reference. So thank you all very much for participating again this week. We will endeavor to do this again next Tuesday. In the meantime, there were a lot of questions still in the queue. Where the questioner has identified himself or herself, we will get back to you shortly with some answers on that. So thank you all very much again, and we'll hopefully talk to you again next week.